You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and yesterday on the channel I had Seek from Venom Vlog on the channel for the first time, and we had a great conversation about staying positive through what you consider to be maybe a down run with your favorite character. You know, obviously him being not so enthusiastic about Donny Cates' run on Venom, and I wanted to talk to him again. You know, get a little bit more insight into Venom. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, I'm great. And thanks for having me back so soon. That was really awesome. It was like getting a second date. It was great.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, we're still courting, but we'll see where this goes.
I don't want to rush things. I don't want to rush things.
I like to do top 5 lists on the channel, and I am not as read up, obviously, on Venom as you are. And we got to get a top 5 Venom list on the channel. I know you got some great choices, and I guess there are a few stories that didn't quite make the list, but you wanted to mention them before we get in here.
Yeah, I would say so mainly what I'm going to be talking about is Venom specific stories, but I did want to give an honorable mention to two, really fun, great stories that are out there that are more Carnage focused, which is Carnage or it's Spider-Man Savage Genesis, which you can find reprinted in the Carnage Classics trade paperback. So that's available now. And those are like Amazing Spider-Man issues 361 to 363. So that's kind of the origin of Carnage. Venom's in it. He plays a big part, but it kind of does focus on Carnage. And then obviously Maximum Carnage, which, it ended up spawning a great video game too. The first video game where you could play as Venom. So, I want to just mention those because they're not in my top 5 list as far as like essential, I guess Eddie Brock and Venom stories, but they should be. So it's hard. It was hard not to squeeze them in, but I did want to mention them because, like I said, Savage Genesis is the origin of Carnage, and that's really great if you want to know more about that character with Woody Harrelson playing him in the upcoming movie. And then Maximum Carnage, if you've never read that, if you're a Spider-Man fan and never read it, I'm shocked. So definitely pick Maximum Carnage up because it's this great like MCU crossover type thing. It was like all these characters like Nightwatch and Deathlock and and Moon Knight and Cloak and Dagger, or maybe Moon Knight wasn't in it. Oh, it was Morbius, and it was just all these like lower tier characters teaming up with Spider-Man to fight against Carnage, who was building a surrogate family for himself, and he found other psychopaths to like from Ravencroft Institute to be on his side. And he had like Shriek was like his surrogate wife, and they had Doppelganger, which was like an evil Spider-Man, as their surrogate child, and then like Demo Goblin was like their surrogate creepy uncle. And it was pretty awesome. And he built this family to go out and like just kill everyone in New York City, and because he loves just blood everywhere, and Spider-Man having to deal with this insane serial killer who built himself a family of like the Devil's Rejects, and so it's awesome. So I would say, I know they didn't make my list, but they should be on my list, to be fair. So I wanted to mention them here.
Well, you got me frothing at the mouth here. That you didn't even get a Maximum Carnage on the list. What is in this top 5? What's your number 5 Venom story?
I would say, just because I'm reading it now, and some of it I'm actually reading for the first time, and it's the Venom run by Rick Remender and Cullen Bunn, which is called Agent Venom. I think the actual book is just named Venom, but the reason I like this is because I'm a big fan of Flash Thompson. I really like his arc in Spider-Man, and if you've followed the character from the beginning, and I have a great video on it that I made on my channel, which just outlines his whole history leading up to him becoming Agent Venom. And so you got, Peter Parker's high school bully who's always looked up to Spider-Man, but always hated Peter Parker and always beat him up and picked on him. He went off to the military, and then in the military, defending his unit, his squad, he gets injured. His legs get shot, and they have to amputate his legs. So he comes back to the U.S. without his legs, and I was like, wow, that's such a real thing. And maybe it's because I've had friends in the military who've been through similar things or have been wounded, and it just really resonated with me. And I was like, well, that's a very truly heroic thing that Flash Thompson has done. And so, of course, you got to sensationalize that with comic books. So when he comes back to the US, he gets put into a program called the Agent Venom program, and he gets bonded with the symbiote. Now the government has control of it, and they allow him to bond with it for 48 hours, and they send him on assassination missions, basically, for the U.S. government and to serve his country. And when he has the suit, obviously he has legs again, so he can run around and he's got like weapons, he's shooting, he's got grenades, and but he has to keep his temper in check, because the more angrier he gets, the more the suit bonds with him. So it's really great, and the stakes are really high because Flash is, he was comatose for a while in the comics. Norman Osborn poured alcohol down his throat when he was a recovering alcoholic, and put him in a car and drove that car into the school that Peter Parker and Flash Thompson grew up in, and he really ruined Flash Thompson's life. So this is Flash trying to get his life back together, but using the symbiote to do so, and the U.S. government, and the government starting out being his friend in the suit, and him not really bonding too well, and then their relationship growing where he actually fundamentally changes the symbiote's outlook on humanity by showing the suit what a real hero is. Because Eddie Brock's, he's a great person and he's a great host and he's fun for stories, but he deep down, he knows the right thing to do, but it takes a lot to get there for Eddie. Flash knows what to do, and it doesn't take a lot for him to make a sacrifice, and that changes the suit on a fundamental level. And so that's why I wanted to bring this story up, because it's essential to the evolution of the character of the symbiote itself.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I really like Rick Remender. He's one of my favorite writers. It's too bad that, well, it's maybe not too bad. He's in an indie comic. It sounds like he kind of enjoys that. He's got his own production like deal going and stuff like that. But man, he did some amazing work at Marvel. When you do something with a character like Venom, to throw a foil in there, or maybe a trigger that you don't want to hit, like you can't get too angry in the suit, or bad things can happen. It ups the stakes, and that's good writing. All right, so what's number 4?
Number 4 is you'll probably think, why isn't it higher on the list? But you got to have this on your list, which is obviously the first appearance of Venom in Amazing Spider-Man 300. They did reprint it in a trade paperback called Spider-Man: The Birth of Venom, so you can find it in that trade paperback. It's by David Michelini, and obviously the art is by the great Todd McFarlane, who I'm a big fan of. And there's also Rick Leonardi, John Byrne, a lot of those guys do art in the trade paperback version of this, as well as like tie-in issues. But this is the birth of Venom, so it's your first. There's Dark Origin, which I'll mention briefly here, which is a retelling of the origin of Venom, and it's good and I like it, but it's definitely a controversial story. A lot of Venom fans don't like it too much, but I do. I think it adds a lot to the origins of Eddie. But this one, at least you got to read this one over anything else, because this is what Todd McFarlane and David Michelini, envisioned for this character. And I do want to give a shout out to Randy Schuler, who is the guy who, if you don't know the story, he designed the black costume. He was like a fan who drew it and sent it into Marvel, and they loved it. And they said, "Hey, we'll buy it off you for like $200." And he was like, "Okay." And then they bought the costume off him and gave it to Spider-Man, and they went on their merry way. And then that became Venom, and it became like a multi-million-dollar idea. But Randy Schuler does get a shout out in the Venom movies, because Eddie Brock lives in a building called the Schuler Building. So, his name is still, honored by Venom creators, which is really cool. But this origin with Todd McFarlane, seeing Venom and Eddie Brock and like his hatred for Spider-Man, you find out that Eddie covered a story that happened earlier in the Spider-Man comics called, I think it was called The Death of Jean DeWolf. And it introduced a villain named the Sin Eater. And he was a cop killer. And Spider-Man caught the real Sin Eater, but Eddie Brock had an informant, because he's a journalist, telling him, I guess confessing to the murders. And when Eddie turned in his guy, he said, "Hey, what's your name? Let me turn you in to the cops so we can stop these murders." Turns out he turned the wrong guy in. The guy who was confessing wasn't the real Sin Eater. So that ruined Eddie Brock's life. And he saw that Peter Parker took the photos of Spider-Man capturing the real, Sin Eater. And so we started hating Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And then when the suit got separated from, Peter, and it bonded with Eddie in the church, that's such an iconic scene where Eddie goes into church and he's praying to God, and saying like, "Hey, I've lost everything. I've been cancel cultured essentially. I made a mistake and everybody hates me now, and New York hates me, and I lost my job and I'm being evicted. And I have nothing. I have nothing else to live for. And I need the strength and forgiveness, because I want to kill myself." And he, as fate would have it, he doesn't get the opportunity to, because the symbiote gets separated from Peter at the top of that church in the church bells, and that rains down on Eddie Brock and turns him to Venom. So it's such an iconic story, and you can't miss it at all. It's really good.
All right, so what's your number 3 Venom story?
This one's a little off the beaten path because it's mainly an Eddie Brock story, but it's a really, really good one. It's only 2 issues. It took place during the Spider-Man Back in Black days, right before One More Day or Brand New Day. And it was written by Robert Aguirre Sacasa, who I think he's written a lot of great stuff that I like. He did the Archie zombie story, and I think he does the current Riverdale show. So he's a really nice guy. He shops at Golden Apple, so I met him a bunch. And around this time, he was writing, Spider-Man, and they were doing Back in Black. And this story is called The Last Temptation of Eddie Brock. So at the point of this in the comics, Eddie Brock has developed cancer, which we're going to talk about in my next pick. So we'll save that for there. But he's developed cancer and has separated from the symbiote. He went to an auction and realized that once he separates from the symbiote, he's going to die of cancer. So he's selling the suit for $100 million to whatever criminal wants to buy it off him. And he's going to give that $100 million to a charity. And so he can have one last good act, I guess, before he dies to make up for the bad act of selling the Venom symbiote away. So he does that. And eventually the Scorpion from the Spider-Man villain gets the symbiote. So Eddie's without the symbiote now, and he's in the hospital and he's dying of cancer. And he finds out that Aunt May, who was recently shot in the story of Back in Black, she is being cared for in the same hospital. And so he has apparently still traces of the Venom suit in him, and that suit still hates Peter Parker. And so he's hearing the voice in his head of Venom. So you're kind of wondering, is he really hearing the voice or is he not throughout the whole story, which I thought was really good and very well handled. And in the story, he's trying to decide if he's going to kill Aunt May while she's weak and vulnerable just to get back at Peter Parker one last time. Because now that the cancer has, defeated him so much, he's now no longer the more optimistic guy where he's like, hey, I gave that money to charity and my last act is a good act. Now he's like, you know what? Maybe I'm just born to be a bad person. And maybe I'm just going to kill this old lady to as one last slight against Peter Parker. And so it's him dealing with that and trying to come to terms with if he's going to go out that way or not. And so it's a really character focused 2 issues of Sensational Spider-Man, issues 38 and 39. And you can, like I said, find them in a book called Peter Parker, Spider-Man Back in Black. And it's pretty moving stuff, and it's really gripping because you wonder the whole time if he's going to do it or not.
Yeah, it's also really interesting because, Absolute Carnage just came out, and one of the big, through lines of that story is all the people that have been bonded with the Venom suit prior. They all have these codexes in them, and, Rhino plays a big part in that. So it's nice that Donny Cates, while he has retconned some stuff, did keep some of the symbiote's history back in the story. That I always like when they tie together like that.
I mean, it's true. I mean, it's hard to say if that's a direct connection to the story or not, because they don't really mention it's a codex. They leave it ambiguous of whether he's really hearing Venom's voice or not. So it's a little bit more ambiguous, but yeah, I mean, I guess he could have easily pulled from this, but it's neat to see the trajectory Eddie goes after this, because his story of redemption after this is the anti-Venom story, where he works at a shelter for homeless people. He volunteers there, even though he still has cancer, he's still fighting it. And he actually befriends Aunt May. So yeah, there's some good this is the redeeming moment of Eddie. Like every story after this, he's pretty much been leaned more hero than anti-hero.
What is your number 2 Venom story?
I love this story because it's Eddie Brock at his worst. It's him at the bottom. Which is a Spectacular Spider-Man, The Hunger. It was a series that was relaunched right around the time of Brand New Day or after Brand New Day. And it's written by Paul Jenkins, who I'm a huge, huge fan of. And Humberto Ramos does the artwork. And it's the first 5 issues focus on Eddie and his relationship with the symbiote and how it's deteriorated. So this is the story where you find out that he has cancer. So when he retells his origin in this book, and he talks about how he went to that church and he was asking God for forgiveness because he was going to take his own life. Well, the reason he was going to take his own life is because he found out when he printed the Sin Eater story around that time when he was up at the top, he found out from a doctor that he had cancer. And so when he lost that senior story, when he was revealed to be a fraud, it was just the string of bad luck. It was the first domino downward for him. And so the symbiote apparently has been, there's an adrenaline, something that your body produces when you have cancer that the symbiote has been feeding off of. So that's the reason it's stayed on Eddie for this long, but it's getting to the point now where Eddie doesn't produce enough of it because the cancer is too bad and the suit isn't really healing him anymore. So it's the two of them at the bottom of their relationship when they're ready to break up essentially, and they're having the worst of it. And in the meantime, they're trying to rebond with it's Eddie trying to get the suit back onto Spider-Man because Eddie still selflessly wants the suit to live, but Eddie himself is coming to terms with being okay with dying. And so it's a really great story that leads into the one we just talked about, but it's really moving on some levels, but the action is really great. And it also introduced Peter Parker has a big moment in this where Flash Thompson, coincidentally, who later becomes Venom, makes an appearance in this story when he's brain dead and he's in a wheelchair, and Peter Parker becomes his caretaker. And there's some really great moments between the two of them as well. So it's kind of serendipitous in a way, or fortuitous that, on some level that Flash is in this story where Venom is trying to look for a new host. And then years later, he becomes the new host of Venom. And I don't know if that was planned, but it was definitely cool that it worked out that way.
Yeah, I think everyone can kind of relate to that. We've all hit rock bottom at some point in our life, and sometimes it's nice to read a story about that, and then know that the redemption is on the way, that there's a brighter day, and there is some coming back from hitting that rock bottom point. And it's nice that Eddie Brock has had that, and like you said, he ever since this point, and when he was redeemed, he's just become a more heroic and fully fleshed out character moving forward.
That's the thing when you look at Eddie's long history is, unlike Spider-Man, where when Spider-Man gets into situations, sometimes you can relate. You're like, oh, he's got to do the responsible thing, like go give his aunt medicine, or he's got to do the other responsible thing, which is go defeat Dr. Octopus or something. But you can not a one-to-one comparison, but you can compare that to things and decisions you make in your own life. Eddie is but a lot of times Spider-Man has unrelatable things, like when he breaks up with Mary Jane, the devil gets involved. So but Eddie's not like that. Eddie deals with real things. If you look at his history, he has very real struggles and real moments. Like his ex-wife Anne Wang, she commits suicide in the comic books because of like a PTSD that she develops after bonding with the symbiote and killing people while wearing it, and it's too much for her. And so that's a very real situation that people can comprehend, as opposed to Spider-Man. So I always look at Venom as, in some ways, the more realistic version of Peter Parker, because Peter Parker does have those up moments. When Eddie has an up moment, it still feels like a down moment. And I know Peter's like that too sometimes, but it's really down for Eddie. But I find that very realistic. So that's why I'm always drawn to the character.
All right, so we've gone through 6 Venom stories. Now it's time for the main event. What's the number 1 Venom story of all times, according to Seek from Venom Vlog?
I would say that this is not the best Venom story out of all of them, and I wouldn't. And again, all these are just my opinions. So if you have a top 5 list, I'd love to hear other people's top 5 lists. But this is the one that I think every Venom fan should read, which is Venom Lethal Protector. That is the most iconic 90s series for a lot of Marvel fans. It's just 6 issues. It was written by David Michelinie, who's the co-creator of Venom. Also has art by Mark Bagley and Ron Lim, and it's fun. It introduces the Life, the Life Foundation came in around the first appearance of Venom, which was like issue 298 of Amazing Spider-Man. But this is like the confrontation with them, the introduction of Carlton Drake on a grander scale. It brings in, Eddie moving to San Francisco. It's his first time doing something heroic, because after the events of Amazing Spider-Man 374 and 375, where Spider-Man helped Eddie save Anne Wang's life, he decided, you know what? There is some good in Spider-Man. All these years I've been hating him. Let's just go our separate ways. You can stay here in New York, and I'm going to go back to San Francisco, where I'm from, and I'm going to try to reconnect with who Eddie Brock is. And so when he goes back, he, reacquaints himself with his father, and gets back into seeing him and starting. You start to see who Eddie Brock is as a person in this series, and then he also befriends a bunch of homeless people, which he does in the first Venom movie too, when one of the ladies gets kidnapped, by the Life Foundation. So it's kind of similar beats from the first movie. They pull a lot from Lethal Protector, and Lethal Protector is just one of those. If you're a Venom fan, it's just a rite of passage. It doesn't matter if it's the best story or not. You got to read it because it's Venom doing a lot of the book on his own, and then in the last issue, teaming up with Spider-Man to save the day. So it's great. And actually, Venom, it's the first time he doesn't do something awful. He just kills his villains and everything like that. He actually takes the Spider-Man road at the end of this. And that's a big moment for the character as far as evolving the character into the person we know today. I think when a lot of people think of Venom, they think of Lethal Protector onward. Because if you go back and read those early McFarlane issues, Venom's a real psychopath who's tormenting Peter Parker, Mary Jane, Aunt May. He's really far gone. He's full on villain. But when you read him in Lethal Protector onwards, it's him embracing, finding the middle ground. And I think that's why this story is so important. So if you're a Venom fan or if you're not, either way, the rite of passage to get into Venom is definitely Lethal Protector.
Man, I'm glad you brought up a story with Mark Bagley. I knew it was going to happen eventually, but it might not be everyone's opinion, but he's my favorite artist for Venom. I think he does the coolest Venom, and right next to him or right behind him is Clayton Crane. I just think those two are the best Venom artists.
Clayton Crane on Venom vs. Carnage and all those stories that he did are great. Mark Bagley, I didn't mention his name, but he was an artist on the Carnage stories that I mentioned at the beginning. Mm-hmm. He's the co-creator of Carnage, so he drew the first Carnage story, and he also drew issues of Maximum Carnage as well. So even though I didn't mention him by name, he was in some of those earlier stories that I talked about.
Yeah, I just think he does the best Venom, and I'm actually pretty happy he's doing the Venom Island story right now. I think he's adding a lot of the flavor that I like to the character.
He came back and did, I think Mike Costa was the writer. He's a G.I. Joe writer, I think, and he came on and did Venom before Donny Cates. And the last two issues he did was a story called The Nativity. And I think Bagley drew those, and they're awesome. They're probably the two best issues of that entire run. And then they teamed up again, I think, for First Host, which was the introduction of Sleeper. So yeah, I love Mark Bagley, and whenever I see him on a Spider-Man or Venom book, I'm like, I'll turn the world off. I'll be like, all of you, go deal with your psychotic stuff. I have a Bagley book to read now.
Well, Seek, thank you so much for joining the channel and counting down your top 5 Venom stories. Really appreciate it. And absolutely, if you have a top 5 Venom stories, put them in the comments below. We'll definitely be checking them out. And we love talking about this kind of stuff. It's what we're here for. It's what we're passionate about. And thank you so much for joining the channel today.
Anytime, man. Thanks for having me back so soon. It was awesome.
All right. Later, buddy.
Later.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.